All right, welcome back, everyone. So now we're going to get into the actual war itself. And, the previous lectures were talking about the events leading up to the war in Europe, some of the long-term events that I'd covered in earlier lectures, and of course, the appeasement policy that we just went through. And eventually, we talked about how in September of 1939, Hitler's going to invade Poland and the war begins. And as we're going to see, this particular lecture is going to focus on this idea of Blitzkrieg. And specifically, I'm going to go through a few countries quickly, but then focus in on the Battle of France, which is, of course, a pivotal moment in World War II history. So here we go. So first of all, there are two sides to the war. As the war begins in 1939, you have the Allies and you have the Axis. The Axis powers, of course, going to be Germany, which by now also includes Austria, part Czechoslovakia, areas that they've already taken over during the appeasement years. Italy, which of course led by Mussolini, is allied with Germany and Japan. And I know I haven't talked about Japan yet, but we will in a future lecture talk about how the United States gets in the war with Japan and the roles there. And since this is a Western Civilization Survey course, I don't go into quite as much detail on it as if you were taking a U.S. history course, but it's obviously going to be an important topic. On the other side, when the war begins, talk about the Allies, primarily it's England and France. And Russia's not in the war. Remember, they had that non-aggression pact, and the United States is not in the war. And just again, even though this is not a U.S. history course, just a couple quick things about the United States. Even though the United States was not involved in World War II when it begins, initially the U.S. does pass what is called the cash and carry policy. And the idea behind the cash and carry policy was basically to say, we will trade with everybody, but you have to bring the cash and carry the stuff back yourself. And the reason the U.S. implemented that is because they believed that would help Britain more, because Britain had a better navy and more had cash on hand. But again, it wasn't really that as dramatic as what happens a little later by 1941. Before the U.S. enters the war, the U.S. passes the Lend-Lease Act. And that was more England, what do you need to fight the war? We'll give you stuff. We'll lend you, lease you, pay us back whenever you want, right? And the idea is kind of a blank check to give them a lot of supplies to fight the war. It still isn't at the end of the day what the Allies are going to need, which is, of course, boots on the ground. And we'll talk about how all that happens later. But the point is, initially, when the war starts, we're dealing with these major powers that are going to be fighting each other. There are going to be some other nations. Let me just show you on the map. People sometimes wonder about. So, like Spain, you could see is going to be neutral. Turkey is going to be neutral till the very, very end of the war. Switzerland is neutral. Sometimes people say, why is Switzerland neutral? Well, Hitler didn't want to invade Switzerland. One, there's a lot of mountains there, and two, there are a lot of banks there. And so he kind of left that alone, where, of course, a lot of the money of the Nazi forces in Germany went through Switzerland. You'll see on this map that we'll be using the different colors, and so the purple pinkish there, that's kind of Germany, Greater Germany, and includes Austria there. You could see over here, right? This would be like the Austria area. The areas that you'll see in blue represents areas occupied by German forces, while the areas you see in green are quote unquote allied. This map also does show the Soviet Union over here fighting against Hitler, but that's going to come later on. We'll explain that as well. So this is a map actually once the war gets going. In your textbook, there's a bit of information on Spain. In my History of the Middle East class, I talk a little bit about Turkey as well, and kind of other things in the Middle East, a bit about World War II. But for our purposes, we really just want to understand what happens early in the war, right? 1939, the war begins. And, a lot of these countries that are quote unquote allied with Hitler, like Hungary, Romania, as you're going to see, I mean, these are nations without a huge military, and they knew what was up. And there's going to be a lot of these folks that just simply collaborate with Hitler. France is going to be an interesting story, as we're going to see here in a minute. So just kind of get you a sense of the map as we start with the actual fighting Hitler does in 1939, and again, what we call Blitzkrieg. So what is Blitzkrieg? Well, Blitzkrieg, a lot of people know this term. It basically translates to lightning war. And that's because, Hitler's philosophy was you hit hard, you hit fast, you take, as many of your men and your tanks and your planes and you launch them into one area and you break them. And it didn't take Hitler too long to get through Poland. So remember, 1939, he invades Poland. Very quickly, he's got control of a good chunk of Western Poland. Within weeks, it falls. Eventually, we'll see more fighting there, especially when the Soviet Union comes in. But Poland falls. And then as we go through 1939, so all of this is kind of into 1939 into 1940, we'll see Norway, Denmark, right? So just to see where these nations are, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, all of these areas are going to fall as we get into 1930, 1940. A little bit later, Yugoslavia and Greece will fall as well, right? They keep fighting. There's fighting there into 1941, but eventually they will fall. And so within really about a year, Hitler conquers tremendous amount of land, considering he's already got an alliance with Italy. He's already got Austria. He's already eaten up Czechoslovakia. He's moved into Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium. Yugoslavia and Greece are gonna fall, right? And then these other countries that I didn't put up here as keywords, but you should probably know, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and these nations are gonna again just form a quote-unquote alliance with Hitler, and they're gonna fall, right? And then you also see countries in North Africa that like Algeria and Libya, they're gonna fall into line with Hitler. So as we move through the early years of the war, just the first year, we see Hitler dominating very quickly. And this is going to be a problem because he's going to be entrenched in there for a long time, which leads us to really the major focus of this particular lecture. And the major focus of this particular lecture is when Hitler's now moved into places like Poland, Norway, Denmark, Holland, and Belgium, he then eyes France. And so we get to May, June 1940, and one of the most pivotal moments early in World War II, the Battle of France. So this one I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about. So what is the deal with the Battle of France? So again, starts about May 1940. We'll go into May, June, as you're going to see. And, with all due respect to all these other countries, they're not France, right? France is a civilization that has been around for a millennium. France is a civilization that had powerful leaders like Louis XIV and Napoleon. France is a civilization that produced many of the Enlightenment thinkers and scientific revolutionary ideas. France is a civilization that had a tremendous military-industrial complex. So when people looked at this moment, they thought, all right, this is the line. This is where finally somebody is going to stand up to Hitler and say no more. Well, the Battle of France begins in May of 1940, and, guys, less than 2 months later, it's pretty much over. And so the question is, what happened? Why was Hitler able to conquer France, this powerful, powerful nation, so quickly? Remember when World War I happened, those of you who watched that lecture, the French, dug in and they held tight and it stayed there. It was bloody, but they held off for a long time. World War II, they just fold very quickly. And I always say when I talk about the Battle of France, there is both military failures and moral failures that led to the loss of the Battle of France. So let's start with the military failures. So one of the terms I have up here, it's a term a lot of people are familiar with, something called the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is this series of fortresses about 280 miles long that's built in between France and Germany, right? So right around here, it's not perfectly, right? But around there, you got the Maginot Line. And the idea behind the Maginot Line was, you create these fortresses. If Germany ever tries to invade into France, they have these fortresses to protect them. Well, what Hitler was able to do is send a decoy force to one part of the region, and then a lot of the French forces went to one part of the Maginot Line, and then Hitler went around, sent all his troops in, and got his men very quickly inside of France. And so that was not very well planned out. The other thing is that the French were not as, advanced militarily strategically. One example I use is during some of the tank battles, the Germans were using radio to communicate with one another, and the French were still raising flags. That's what you would do. You would raise one flag, and that would tell your tanks where to move, and raise another flag and tell your tanks where to move. And, the Germans were using radio. And so this helped them. So there was just strategic reasons, and again, if you were to take this is just a survey course, I'm not going to go into every detail on this, but at the end of the day, Hitler's forces simply outmaneuvered the military of the French. But beyond that, and I think to me something I always emphasize because I think it's so important, is if you look at the map of France, do you notice how it's two colors, right? There's the green and the red, and it's almost split in half. And the southern part of France here is known as Vichy France. What's the deal? So the blue means occupied by Nazi forces. The green means allied with Hitler. And so there was this man named Maurice Papone. Now, for people who know a lot about World War II, this is a pretty common name. For people who don't know much about World War II and French history, they may have never heard of him. And Maurice Papone was what we would call a Nazi collaborator. So what's a Nazi collaborator? These were individuals during World War II who weren't Nazis, but worked with the Nazis. And Maurice Papone, who was actually a hero of the French from World War I, was one such Nazi collaborator. He works a deal out with Hitler where he tells Hitler, hey, don't invade your forces into southern France, Vichy France as it's known. I will take care of that area for you. You want me to round up Jews for you? I will round up Jews for you. You want me to suppress the French resistance? I will suppress the French resistance. What's the French resistance? Look, even though France falls fairly quickly in this war, there were still the resistance forces in France, just literally just average civilians who were with their guns and saying, we're going to fight, we're going to resist. We don't want to be under Nazi occupation. And the Nazi collaborators, the French Nazi collaborators, ratted them out. They told the Nazis, hey, they're there or over there, go find them. You can imagine we have stories after the war where some of these Nazi collaborators were found and they were, just horrifically beaten and so forth by the French. But Maurice Papone was one of these key guys who went ahead and did this. And I do think this played a big role in allowing Hitler to dominate France because for a good chunk of the war, he didn't have to worry about the southern part of France. And then it also, later on, thinking ahead, gives him more opportunity to build up the military defenses in the northern part of France, right, around Normandy, which we'll talk about later. And of course, that's going to be significant later on when we talk about the D-Day invasion and how, bloody that was. And so all of this is key to World War II. Now, the other name you see here is a much lesser known name, a man named Maurice Papone. And this is an interesting story, and it's something I've been talking about for many, many, many years now. It's an older story, but it's not a name I expect people to know, right? Unlike Papon, it's a name many people know. Papon was another Nazi collaborator. He wasn't one from France. He wasn't one of the big names like Papon. But we do know a few things about him. We know he was responsible for rounding up about 1,700 Jewish people and sending them to gas chambers during World War II. And after the war, as many of these Nazi collaborators, it took a while to find him. But he was eventually found, he was put on trial, and he was found guilty for crimes against humanity. He sent 1,700 human beings to gas chambers. So years ago, I found this old story about him. This goes back all the way to the year about 2002. And what had happened is they found this guy, Maurice Papone. They had sentenced him to jail. And he wasn't in jail very long. By this point, the guy's like 92 years old. And so he spends a couple of years in jail, and then the French government released him. Why did they release him? They said, well, he's a 92-year-old man. We're going to let him go. And I've never forgotten that story because to me, it was really an indication of how people forget history. The man put 1,700 human beings in gas chambers. Frankly, I don't care he was 92 years old. He put 1,700 human beings in gas chambers simply because of their faith. And the French government let him go. And to me, this is kind of a story of forgetting history, of not, when you start to have a generation that isn't as emotionally impacted by things, people are like, it happened a while ago, he's an old man, we'll let him go. And that's a serious failure, I think, to have that kind of mentality. And this is why I think we need to study this. Now, does this mean, everyone in France has forgotten these kind of things? Of course not. Wait till we talk about the World War II story in Normandy, and I will tell you now, there are people to this day who are unbelievably grateful in France to the United States. And I'll show you what I mean by that when we talk about the D-Day invasion in a future lecture. But there's still this interesting dilemma of, are people forgetting? So at the end of the day, we get to June of 1940, France is falling, and now Hitler's pretty much got almost everything in Europe, right? Again, the Germans aren't, the Russians aren't in the war. He's got Italy allied with him. Yugoslavia, Greece are again about to fall. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. France falls. If France falls, what hope is left for anybody else? And so as we get to June of 1940, there's really just one more nation standing here, and that's Britain. And the question is, if you're Britain in June of 1940, what kind of world are you living in? And so the next lecture I want to talk about is going to be pretty intense, and it's going to kind of give you an overview of what is going on in the world of June of 1940 and what the British have to face. So that's going to be our next topic, and then from there we'll get into the Battle of Britain and get into some other key points of World War II. All right, so I hope all of that is clear, and you get those details down on the Battle of France. Again, you can definitely find a lot more information out there, but for my course, if that's what you know, you're good to go. All right, everyone, thank you.